First of all, in terms of the title, this is a very positive workshop. In other words, the title could have been something like the dangers of working with, the dangers of individual therapy vis-a-vis the marriage, and it could have been like an article in AMI about how individual therapy damages marriages. This is a really positive workshop. This is about how we can be better therapists. And I'm saying that because there's going to be a lot of negative stuff that I'm going to be saying. I'm going to be saying really nasty things about therapy. But I'm a therapist. I love therapy, and it's going to be everything we say negative is going to be more like, you look at it in terms of a defensive driving course. You tell people how dangerous driving is. It's not because you don't want them to drive. Honoring the space between. The space between is a term that is that's used. It's attributed to Martin Buber, but I think it goes way much further back than that. The space between a client and a therapist, the space between a husband and a wife, whenever there's a human interaction, whenever there are two people interacting with each other, there's stuff that goes back and forth between them. There's an entity called the space between. There's a real entity. There's something that exists. It's the Bain in Bein Adam Lachavero. There's an entity there called Bain. And that space, it's made up of the things that happen between the husband and wife that are not observable in the husband, that are not observable in the wife. It's just kind of, it's in that space that exists between them. Now, there are four things that I want to cover in today's workshop. Concepts relevant to the interface between individual therapy and marriage. These are just basic concepts that I'm going to use in 2, 3, and 4. Then I want to cover the potential for individual therapy to really harm, potentially, a marriage, how individual therapy interfaces with a marriage, the potential for individual therapy to interfere with couples therapy, and then there's a protocol developed. I don't know if any of you have heard of William Doherty, Bill Doherty. He developed a protocol called couple-sensitive individual therapy. I was working, a year ago, I was working to put together a protocol for this, and in my research I bumped into something that he did. He had a whole bunch of slides on it. I thought it was perfect, and I emailed him, asked him if I could use his slides, so that's going to be section 4. Personal values in psychotherapy. We tend to think that therapists, when I went into therapy, I thought therapy was, I'm going to be values neutral. It's about the client's values. It's not about my values. And I don't have an agenda. It's not agenda driven in any way. But the truth is, the reality is our own personal values will often play a role in psychotherapy, even from a place of being non-judgmental. I'm non-judgmental. I'm accepting unconditional positive regard. But even from that place of being non-judgmental toward my client, our personal values can influence our case conceptualization. It's just the way it is. So, for example, a 19-year-old yeshiva bacher comes into my office and tells me that he's having a sexual relationship with an 18-year-old Beis Yaakov girl who is his neighbor. What's the presenting problem? How do I define this as a problem? Or what's the issue? Maybe the issue is his parents. Maybe the issue is his guilt. Maybe his issue is connection to some primitive religion that's inhibiting his self-actualization. The reason why I'm putting this up there is because my personal statement here is marriage is a value for me. And you're going to see that coming up all over the place. When I say marriage is a value, what that means is it impacts my case conceptualization. It doesn't mean that every marriage, there are marriages that need to end. There are situations of abuse. And when there's clear abuse, most of what I'm going to be presenting this morning is irrelevant. The question, though, is there clear abuse? And that's going to be part of what we're going to be talking about. But once I look at marriage as a value, it's something that's important to me. It's going to influence my case conceptualization, and it's going to influence this workshop. In the same way that I would look at this 19-year-old yeshiva bacher, my value system is going to influence my case conceptualization. My value system will influence what happens to me when an individual comes into my office for issues totally unrelated to the marriage, or it's issues related to the marriage. The marriage is a value. Just some basic limitations of psychotherapy. Now, I'm just this is going to be a list of just certain basic things that are limitations in psychotherapy. What I mean by limitations, the word limitations here, in this context, does not mean problems or shortcomings. It's simply a reference to the fact that this very powerful and productive tool that we call therapy, like every other tool, has limits. If I have a screwdriver and I can't eat a bowl of soup with it, that's a limitation of a screwdriver, but I wouldn't say the screwdriver has a problem, has shortcomings. It doesn't do what a spoon does, so it's problematic. No, it's a limitation. Psychotherapy is a very, very powerful tool, but there are limits to it, and we need to be aware of those. As therapists, we need to be aware of those limitations, because otherwise we'll be using a screwdriver to try to eat our soup. I think the biggest limitation in terms of individual therapy, and that's going to be a theme throughout this morning, is the problems in a relationship often lie in the space between, what I just described before. That entity that's constructed in between the husband and the wife. It's not in the room. It's not sitting in the room in individual therapy. It doesn't exist unless the husband and wife are there. Just a small example. I can give dozens, maybe hundreds of examples. But a couple that comes into my office, I'm thinking of one particular couple that I'm going to talk about, where I did speak to the individual therapist on both sides of this relationship, including a Rav on both sides. This was a case that had, one of these cases that have 20 people in the mix even before it gets into your office, and everybody's calling you to tell you exactly what the problem is. So the talk about the wife was both from the husband's therapist, the Rav, and the child's therapist, was that she's borderline. She's borderline, emotionally dysregulated. There's, she just needs to go to therapy, DBT. Couples therapy is probably not going to work. From the conversation I had with the wife's therapist, who was like a lone holdout in this whole picture, was that she's a wonderful person who's married to a narcissistic, controlling person, and who doesn't stop destroying her. And nobody agreed with that picture, but besides the wife's therapist. But the wife's therapist never met the husband. The husband's therapist never met the wife. And that's going to be a problem that I'm going to be talking about this morning. Nobody met anybody. Everybody's working with individuals. And it wasn't until the fourth session. I sit with the client, when I do couples work, I sit with the couple together the first session, then I meet with each one individually, then I meet with them together. So I didn't see this in the first session. I didn't see this when I was talking to the husband. Seemed like a really nice guy who's married to a borderline, emotionally dysregulated woman. Speaking to the wife in individual therapy, she's married to a narcissistic, controlling husband. That was there. That's what I saw. In the fourth session, about halfway through the session, I saw something that I don't think anybody could have seen if the two of them weren't in the room together. And this is what I mean by the space between. She said something to him. I mean, this is a classic. I'm picking this couple, but I can pick 20 other couples. She said something to him that was this much attacking. Like, it was actually just a why sentence. Why would you want to do that? Nothing. And here's what he did. It's so subtle, you're going to have to watch me to see what he did. That was it. And she went ballistic. She went completely ballistic. She lost it. She started yelling at me, and he's looking at me. See that? See? And that was it. Right there was, and the more he went like this, I watched him just move away. He just disappeared. And the more he disappeared, this is Sue Johnson's classical pursuer withdrawer, the more he disappeared, the more she attacked, the more dysregulated she got. This was the only place in the universe that she behaved like that. I was once talking to Perry Hoffman about a couple. I don't know if any of you know Perry Hoffman, one of my favorite therapists, and she said, I made a comment to her that this woman, it seems like only in the marriage, like she has this, I don't know if she's borderline. She has this borderline behavior with her husband, but outside in the world, it doesn't seem that way. And Perry said, yeah, she's borderline in the marriage. Like, okay, let's move on. So, what? She wasn't surprised. I mean, this is a normal thing. There's borderline in the marriage. And it's coming out of the attachment pain that exists in the marriage. It's coming out of that space between that only exists in the room. Nobody could have seen this had they not talked to the husband and wife and watched this in front of them. You could have spent 20 years with the husband, 20 years with the wife. This wouldn't have been noticed. This dynamic would not have been noticed. What his facial expression did to her and what her attack did to him. And he was accused of being a controlling husband and us because he acted unilaterally in everything. Because he was like, I can't talk to her. I can't talk to her. So of course I'm going to do this without her and I'll do that without her. That's what I'm talking about by the space between. Once that dynamic is acknowledged, you can start to work with the couple. It doesn't show up in individual therapy. You'll never see it. This is just a call out for humility. The therapy room is a very small and isolated segment of the client's world. There are 168 hours in a week. They only spend one in our room. We make decisions that are the most important decisions of their life. We don't go home to their kitchen with them. We're not there in their bedroom. It speaks for itself. Sorry. This is another limitation. It also speaks for itself. Transference, counter-transference. We have our own stuff. We all bring our own stuff into the room. And it interferes with how we see the person sitting in front of us. It interferes my view of the client. I have a man sitting in front of me who's complaining about his wife. He's touching me. He's touching my heart. I hear things that who knows what kind of counter-transference is going on inside of me. The therapist is human. That's another limitation. This is a quote from Sue Johnson. I could have quoted Bowlby on this, but in the context that Sue Johnson was saying this, she was saying this in the context of a marriage. Secure dependence and autonomy. This is really Bowlby, but I'm just quoting Sue Johnson who quotes Bowlby. Secure dependence and autonomy are two sides of the same coin rather than dichotomies. The more securely connected we are, the more separate and different we can be. This is so important. In individual therapy, the more securely connected we are, the more separate and different we can be. When a client comes in, what I'm trying to do is help them self-actualize. I'm trying to help them be autonomous. I'm trying to help them be authentic. I'm trying to help them be themselves, to be separate and different. In the process of helping my client become separate and different, am I also helping them become securely connected? Or am I breaking that secure connection? The woman in New Square, whose therapist helps her drive a car and have a smartphone so that she can be, and I'm not making this up, so that she can be autonomous and authentic and self-actualize. What's happening? What's happening to her secure connection? What happens to her? Now she has self-actualized. She also loses her husband, her children, her community. She's all alone in the world. And she loses her ability to be separate and different and becomes alone and depressed. And I'm gonna come back to this later on. This is really an important piece. When we're working with an individual, we're trying to help that individual, but keeping in mind how important it is that their secure connections are intact. That is so important in individual therapy.
So you're helping them within their own context.
What was that?
You're helping them within their own context.
Helping them within their own context. Because if I lose focus on their context, if I lose focus of their attachment bonds, and I just look at them as an individual, and I help them to actualize as an individual, and in that process they lose their attachment bonds, according to Bowlby, they lose their ability to self-actualize also. Can I help this person self-actualize? Can I help them to be somebody without destroying their secure connections, their secure dependence? That's going to be the challenge. Okay? Let's talk for a minute about validation. There are two levels of validation, two types of validation. Validation is the bread and butter of therapists. That's what we do. We validate. It's so important to be aware of the difference between validating somebody's reality and validating somebody's experience. In individual therapies, very often it doesn't make a difference in terms of the individual, which one I do. But when I validate somebody's reality, it feels so much better. It feels so much better to them. When I validate their experience, what do I mean by this? Validate reality. So a client comes and tells me that last Tuesday they were abducted by Martians and held for 48 hours in captivity. Okay? No, this one I made up. I could say to them something like, you seem so frightened. It must have been, what was that like for you? What was your experience? The fear. I'm going to try to get into the fear, into the loneliness that was there in those 48 hours there. But it's very different than saying to them, and I'm really validating what they experienced. But it's very different than saying to them something like, yeah, those Martians, there's something else. When you were abducted by the Martians, that must have been very scary for you. I just validated the reality. I just told them that what they experienced was real. There are times when we have to validate somebody's reality, and there are times when we really shouldn't. If a woman is being abused and is confused about what's happening, there may be situations where I really have to tell her, that was abuse. There's something happening here that maybe you're not realizing, but there's a I want to validate your reality. But if I'm not sure, and I validate the reality, I'm treading on very dangerous ground. When I validate somebody's reality, if someone's reality has been validated, then it becomes almost impossible to validate their experience. Once I tell you, yeah, those Martians were really bad, then the next person who tells you, it must have been so scary for you when when you felt like you were being. What do you mean when I felt? It was there. It happened. Oh, that must have been so hard. Imagine somebody when something is real, when something is clearly 100% real, and we validate experience, it's invalidating. If somebody comes into my office with a black and blue mark and a bloody nose, and says, my husband punched me, and I say something like, oh, that must have been so, that experience. I talk about the experience that they had. I've just invalidated her. If I don't validate that reality, there's blood coming out of it's real. When an individual therapist validates reality, it sets up a situation where not the couples therapist and not the husband or wife at home can do any kind of validation of experience. And I'm going to come back to this later. That difference between validation of experience and validation of reality is critical in individual therapy. If I'm sitting with a couple, my bread and butter as a couples therapist is validation. Validate, 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 validate. If I say it must be so hard when it feels like your husband wants to do that to you, what I'm going to get back is if that person's reality has been validated, what I'm going to get back is, please don't be condescending to me. My husband's a jerk. My husband is a controlling, narcissistic jerk. My therapist told me so. That one I didn't make up. I've got another issue with validation is I can validate with words and I can validate with actions. And if I perceive you to be able to validate me with actions and you validate me with words, it's invalidating. What does that mean? Imagine a child whose mother doesn't spend enough time with him and doesn't spend any time with him and is always busy with work. And so the child is sitting in the therapist's office and saying, my mother's always at work, she's always busy, she doesn't care about me. And the therapist says, wow, that must be so hard for you. That's very validating. Then the child goes home to the mother and says, Mommy, you don't spend time with me, you're always busy at work, you don't care about me. And the mother says, it must be so hard for you. That's very invalidating. That's not a validating statement. When I perceive you to be able to validate me with actions, and you validate me with words, it's invalidating. And again, I'm going to use this a little bit later to talk about how this interferes with couples therapy. Once the client sees the therapist, as individual therapists, we are in a situation where we can validate with words. It's very easy to validate with words. But we have to remember that the spouse, if the spouse does the same thing I'm doing, and the client perceives the spouse to be able to change, now the spouse becomes invalidating, or the couples therapist becomes invalidating. And we'll go into more detail of that. Linear cause and effect versus circular cause and effect. Another really important concept, especially when you're comparing couples therapy and individual therapy. We think of cause and effect in linear terms. This and then that. The question, what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? There are one of two questions. It can't be, there is no third answer. The chicken came first or the egg came first, A or B. That's linear cause and effect. There's a line, this, then this, then this, then this, and this. In interpersonal communication and family systems, cause and effect are circular. They're not linear. So the answer to what came first, the chicken or the egg, in interpersonal relationships is this. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Yes, that's the answer. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this couple that we talked about before, the couple where he goes like this and she attacks, they would pursue withdrawal, what came first? It's not a matter of it's so hard to figure out which one came first. Neither one came first. This is happening together. This is happening as one system. Because the attack is not really an attack, it's a perceived attack. It's only perceived as an attack because of his background. He goes like this, and that's perceived because of her background. There's what caused what is impossible. It's not impossible it's not just impossible to find the cause, there is none. It's circular. Difference between business and marriage. The reason why this slide is up here is I was working with a couple. The husband was very, very forgetful. He just forgot. So she would ask him to bring home stuff. And when you go to the grocery store, can you make sure to get eggs, 2 dozen eggs? And he would forget. And constantly forgetting things. And the therapist, her individual therapist, made a comment to the client. Now, most of what I'm going to be talking about here, I'm talking about good individual therapy. I'm not talking about this bad individual therapy and it messes up marriages. I'm talking about good individual therapy that interferes with the marriage. But the example I'm going to give you is bad therapy. So the individual therapist says to the client in her individual therapy session, so if your husband's boss would ask him something, do you think he would forget? And boy, did that set up a problem in couples therapy. What's wrong with that statement? It's true. If his boss would have asked him, he would never forget. So why is there, what she said was right. And the answer is as follows. It's a very simple answer. When in business, the behavior is primary, the reason for the behavior is secondary. If I have an employee, and that employee shows up, instead of 9 o'clock every morning, shows up at 9:15, 9:20 every morning, there's a behavior there that's interfering with the business. I might be a nice boss and say, what's going on? Is something going on at home? But after a while, I don't care about the reason anymore. After a while, he can have a lot of really good reasons, but after a while, the reasons become irrelevant. It's the behavior that's primary. The process in a business relationship is secondary. If I'm sitting at a business meeting and we're schmoozing, we're friends, it's nice, there's a nice relationship going on, that relationship is important because of the business, because of the content of what's really important is the content, What's really important is the content. The relationship is only a means to an end. So over here also, I'm going to be nice to you. I want to know why you come late every morning. But at the end of the day, it's the content. Why is not important anymore. Either you come at 9 o'clock or you're fired. In a marriage, the single most important thing in the marriage is not that the husband or the wife is showing up at 9:20 instead of 9 o'clock. We said we're going to leave the house at 9. How come you're never always late? The how come is more important to the marriage than the actual behavior. The behavior is secondary. Why are you behaving this way? That's what's going to come up in couples therapy. That needs to be the dialogue between the husband and wife. That's what they need to be talking about for the next 80 years. That's what's really important to the relationship. If this husband is forgetful and he keeps on forgetting the 2 dozen eggs, why he forgets, What's happening there? What's happening in that dynamic? Is there something about his wife? Is there something that he can possibly change? That's what's important, because the relationship is the single most important thing. In business, the relationship is secondary. Some of the reasons why accurate spousal reporting can be inaccurate. When a client comes into my room and they're talking to me, it's very hard when reporting is inaccurate. Sometimes we could feel it. There's something wrong with this reporting. There's something inaccurate over here. But what if the reporting is really accurate? If the reporting is really accurate, it's hard to pick it up. It's hard to know. The client is telling me the truth. If you put a lie detector on the client's, attach a lie detector to the client, what they're saying is going to be true. I don't know if you've heard of these 4 things. I'm just going to go through these quickly. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is I have a core belief that I'm stupid, and I just got a 99 on my math test, and then I got a 97 on my history test, and I got 100 on my English exam. So the math test, I just got lucky. I filled an answer. I don't know. The history test, that everyone knows that teacher gives easy tests. And then I get a 46 on one test. After 10 tests, or maybe I got 10 tests where I got in the 90s, and then I got a 46. I told you I was stupid. You want the proof? There's the proof. We only allow in confirmation bias. Somebody once explained it to me like this, and I think it's a beautiful metaphor. You ever see those toys, the balls for babies, where they have a little bit of shapes in the toy, and you take the shape and you stick it into the ball, right? So there's squares, there's circles, there's rectangles, and the baby has to fit the right shape to the right. Imagine that you have a whole pile of all different shapes, 10 different kinds of shapes, but the ball only has circles. So if the baby tries any other shape, the only thing that's going to go in is the circles. At the end of the day, the baby's going to have a ball with all circles. And he comes over to you and says, and you look at the ball, and you would think that all the baby had was circles. Really, the baby had everything else. If I have a core belief, the only thing that comes in, confirmation bias filters out every other event. It only filters in what I really believe in. And I use this with clients sometimes, and in our dialogue, sometimes in a session, they'll say, yeah, that was a square, ain't going in. And the metaphor is very powerful, but that's what confirmation bias does. And the problem with confirmation bias is it's so real to us. If I have that bias, then I will come into my therapist's office, and I'm going to tell them facts. I'm going to tell them about that 46. Fundamental attribution error is when I see you doing something. Let's say I see somebody coming late every day, and I say, that person doesn't care enough about this, that's why they come late. I also come late. I might also show up at 9:10 to work. But he shows up at 9:10 to work because, he doesn't care. I had to do carpool. I attribute reasons to other people's actions. When I look at you and I see a behavior, all I see is your behavior. How do I interpret that behavior? I interpret that behavior by looking inside myself and saying, so if I were doing that, what would that look like? I attribute a reason for what you're doing. All I see is the behavior, but there's an attribution of a reason. Once I attribute a reason, then that reason becomes the reality. My husband forgets. Sorry, there's a lot of countertransference in this one because I always forget everything. So, But my husband forgets because he doesn't care. And now I walk into the therapist's office and I say, my husband doesn't care. I don't say, it's not about the behavior anymore. What I'm reporting is the reason, and that reason becomes my reality. Mood congruency effects is fascinating research that's been done on this, that we see things based on our mood. If I'm in a bad mood, and you do something, my mind will filter out the positive aspects of it. If I'm in a good mood, my mind will filter out the negative aspects of it. So what I'm reporting is accurate, but that's all that went in. And the last thing, perceived punctuation of events. I'm sure anybody who's done couples therapist, anyone who's tried to put a story together with two people, perceived punctuation of events. Where did this start? Where do you put the period? Where did this event start? So the wife will say, the story started this morning when we woke up and he looked at me and he gave me this look and he made this nasty comment. Okay, that's where the story started. And then it just went on from there. But the husband is going to say, it started this, the wife says it started this morning. The husband said, no, it didn't start. It started last night. Because last night, when you said to me that's where it started. And the wife says, it started when we were born. Where do you put the period? There's no way to know where to put the period. Because of these four things, somebody's telling us something. It feels so real. It just feels so real. And that reality is what impacts us. Who am I? I'm not doing this from a philosophical perspective. This is just from a plain, simple psychological perspective. Who am I depends on who I am with. Yeah, staying away from the philosophical parts of this. The self that shows up in a therapy room is different, could be different than the self that shows up in other areas of the client's universe. I had the experience of seeing a client of mine who manages a retail establishment, who comes into my office depressed and humble and contrite and withdrawn. And I went into the store that he manages, and I saw an aspect of him. I had to go buy something, and he was there. And I saw an aspect of him that I have never seen in my office. He was confident and just oozing confidence. He was just all over the place and talking to people and bossing people around. And we processed this in the next session. It was a fascinating thing to process. The client that appears in therapy, imagine the world that they're sitting in. They're sitting in a world where behaving inside the transference, they're behaving inside the transference counter-transference construct. There's a space between the client and the therapist also, and they're behaving inside of that. They're also reacting to an environment of unconditional positive regard. Where else in the world are they getting that? So who they are sitting in front of me is different. So what's important is when I see this client sitting in front of me, who they are at home may be somebody completely different. They're not getting unconditional positive regard from their spouse. They're just not. This is a quote. These three articles, I just felt I needed to put out there because they contributed so much to a lot of the stuff that I'm saying today. But this is a quote. It's not a quote. It's actually a condensation of the ideas that are in these three articles. Our client, as their personality manifests in the relation to their partner, may express a different self than our client as their personality manifests in therapy. There will be zones of character that only spring to life in that other relationship, and we will never see it in the therapy room. Our view is sometimes distorted. We sometimes have a distorted view because we are immersed in the therapy room. We're immersed in emotional reality, and emotional reality can differ from what is objectively observed. When I look at a person, I see what's objectively observed. What's going on inside of each one of you, I haven't got a clue, and you haven't got a clue what's going on inside of me. The emotional reality is just a different reality. When we're in the therapy room, we're focused on the client's emotional reality. That's what we want to see. There's something fascinating about emotional reality, and that is that this is coming out of those three articles that I quoted before. Concurrent contradictory emotional realities can coexist, whereas objective external reality is fixed. I'll say that in English. In my emotional world, I can want to pick up this cup, and I can not want to pick up this cup, both, and they can coexist. I can love you, and I can hate you, and both can coexist. When clients say, I'm so confused, I don't know, do I love him, do I hate him, I don't know, I'm just so confused. No, you're not confused. There's no confusion there. Both realities can coexist. But in the objective world, I'm either going to pick up this cup or I'm not going to pick up this cup. I can't do both. So when we're swimming with a client in their emotional world, we're swimming where there's so many different realities taking place at one time. The client goes home to their husband or their wife, only one reality is there. It's the behavior. It's what they do. Sometimes nobody else besides the therapist sees that reality. They see one fixed reality. We see so many different realities. So we see the client from a place that nobody else sees the client from. Focusing on the emotional and psychodynamic roots of a client's world may cause us to lose focus on the behavioral faults. Example of this. A client walks into my... okay, this is an actual example. I came about 7 or 8 minutes late to a session once to a client who I sometimes have a bad habit that I need therapy for. My sessions can go 5-10 minutes over sometimes. And with this guy especially, there's some clients that just pull you in, and I always had a hard time ending sessions with him, so I can go 10 minutes over with him. And I was seeing him for like 6 months. And at one point, I came one session, I came in about 7 or 8 minutes late, and he made some kind of really nasty comment, an angry comment to me. And he didn't want to let it go. Just not really caring about this whole thing, you're not taking this seriously. And, my first reaction was, I'm not going to say what my first reaction was, but then I went into therapist mode. I immediately, okay, let's, I'm the professional here. And I approached it from the perspective of, wow, this seems to be so annoying for you. Or something, I don't remember what I said, but it must have been something along those lines. And then we got into a whole discussion. And it was really a beautiful discussion about how he feels pushed down by authority figures, feels like a nothing in this world, and what my coming 7 to 8 minutes late meant to him. For me, it was just 7 to 8 minutes late. For him, it was nobody really cares about me in this whole universe. That's beautiful therapy, but if I get lost in that, I'm missing something really important. In the world, nobody else on this planet is going to do what I just did. When he goes out into the world and he says something really nasty to somebody who came 7, 8 minutes late, if he says something to his wife and his wife thinks, are you kidding? Do you know what I just did for you? Do you know what I just wanted you to... She's not going to say, wow, that must have been so hard for you. That's not what's going to happen. So I'm missing his behavioral faults if I'm not really conscious of it. I'm being immersed in his emotional reality, and by being immersed in his emotional reality, I might lose focus on behavioral faults. I think this is something that happens a lot in individual therapy. I'm guilty of this. I think we're human beings. We get pulled into this emotional reality of the client. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is the things that make us a good therapist, being able to see a client from the perspective from the strength perspective. I'm looking for their strengths. Unconditional positive regard. I'm accepting, non-critical, non-judgmental. I'm being an empathic caregiver. These are the things that make us acutely sensitive to the emotional world of our clients, but less sensitive to their burdensome qualities. We don't really pick up on some of the client's burdensome qualities. We just don't see it. Just a quote from this article. I would not have been able to say this. I wouldn't have the guts to say this unless it was quoted from an article. But let me just read this quote. The caregiver's exquisite sensitivity to certain cues is accompanied by suppression of her perception of other cues. Therapists, like mothers to their children and lovers to their partners, are acutely sensitive to their patients. Responding to their patients' distress, they may become acutely sensitive to the emotional lives of their patients, but less sensitive to their burdensome qualities. But most of my point here is, in the context of a marriage, imagine what's happening over here. I'm seeing an individual client, and I'm immersed in their emotional world. I may be, in an individual session, I may be totally clueless about what's going on in the marriage. She's living with a narcissistic, controlling husband. He's living with a borderline. I feel bad for him. I want to be her caregiver. That's happening in my office. It's not happening in the kitchen. Never confuse social justice with what is best for your client at this moment. Like, this line has been like a guiding light for me in a lot of my work. Client is sitting in front of me, and they are a victim of social injustice. That case that I mentioned before with the therapist who wanted to empower a woman to drive a car and use a smartphone. That was a therapist who felt that this woman was being victimized. And maybe she was right, maybe she was wrong, depending on the perspective you're coming from. But there's a social justice cause. If I have a 17-year-old who's being crushed, I feel, by the yeshiva system, and there's a social injustice taking place over here. Whatever, there's something happening over here, and that's just not just. It's not fear. That has nothing to do with the person sitting in front of me right now. With the relationship that I have with a client in therapy is about what's best for them right now. It's not about social justice in the world. Now I'm going to go into section 2, which is we're going to just take some of the ideas that we just used and look at potential for negative impact on the marriage. I'm just going to go through a bunch. This is focused on individual therapy and marriage. Not necessarily couples therapy, but the interface between individual therapy and marriage. The first thing we've discussed already. In individual therapy, any assessment of the spouse's behavior is done without access to the space between and without access to the spouse's subjective reality. We don't really know. It's not there. It's not in the room. This is really important. Individual therapy raises conflict issues without laying the friendship, admiration, attachment foundation for conflict management. In Gottman's worldview, managing conflict only can come after we've set up a friendship. We've set up some kind of platform of friendship, admiration, attachment, attunement, whatever words you want to use. But there has to be that. A conflict. Gottman is very into positive sentiment, negative sentiment. Anybody who's familiar with the Gottman method. Developing a positive sentiment is critical to being able to manage conflict. So if there's a positive sentiment in the marriage, the negative issues become unimportant. I had a couple that, and I do this a lot in different ways, but in this particular case, this is what happened. When he came in with a list. When I met him in his individual session that I have with him, he took out a piece of paper and he went down a list of things that he wrote about his wife. There were two sides to the paper. And I was taking notes, and he had two sides of complaints. And 8 months later, we were in the process of terminating. It was actually very, it was just a nice, good couple to work with. And 8 months later, we were in the process of terminating, and I do this a lot, but what I'll do before we terminate, so I'll start seeing them once a month. Before we went to the once a month maintenance, I speak to each one separately, just to make sure that, I want to process this alone with each of you. And when I was processing it alone with him, I took out my notes from the first session. And I said, I showed him the paper. I said, remember this? And I did this because I just had confidence that it would work. And I really wanted to drive home a point to him. And he looks at it, and he says, nah, doesn't make a difference. That was his remark. Managing conflict needs to sit on it. But once there's a friendship there, once there's a positive sentiment there, the content of the conflict sometimes becomes almost irrelevant. One thing that Gottman and Sue Johnson both have in common is it's not about the content. It's really not about the content. And when a husband and wife are fighting with each other, that's not it. That's not it. So what happens in individual therapy is the client is coming in with content. My husband did this, my wife did this. And the focus of the individual therapy is on the content. So we're processing content, we're processing conflict without that whole piece that every couples therapist, every model of couples therapy says that's the key. What ends up happening is the content becomes so important. Individual therapy takes the content and puts it on a pedestal. Couples therapy takes the content, takes it off the pedestal, or at least it tries to. So it's something as individual therapists we just need to be aware of. We just need to be aware a client comes in, they're coming in with content. I cannot help this couple process their relationship. I can't go beneath the content. I can't explore the space between. I can't create more positive sentiment because I don't have the two people in the room. So what I end up doing is I'm processing content. We need to be so aware of that. If we fall into that trap, there's enormous damage that could happen in the marriage. Because the clients need to consult a therapist. The individual therapist can impede marital communication. The spouse can sometimes feel that they're always talking to their spouse's therapist rather than the spouse. This should have been another thing. I had one husband tell me, I can't talk to my wife, I can't tell her anything unless I want her therapist to know it. That's scary. What about validation issues in general? So this is a lot of the stuff we talked about. A therapist can unknowingly be competing with the spouse as the primary source of validation and can cause the client to be angry. I've seen this. I'm so angry at my spouse, she doesn't get it, or he doesn't get it. There's an anger that shows up. When I come into therapy and I say something, I share about how hard, what a jerk my boss is, and my therapist says, wow, that must be so hard for you. And then I go home to my wife or my husband, and he or she says, you want to maybe get a new job? Oh, God. Okay, then I just stop saying this. What's the matter with you? You don't understand me. That's what happened. It may not have happened before the therapist. It happens also now in therapy, and I say, wow, there's another way to respond. And now I wait to go. I become angry at my spouse, and I wait to go to therapy to share these things. I've seen this play out in good marriages that were really good until one individual came to therapy. If the client's reality is being validated by the therapist, then the client's ability to accept the spouse's subjective reality becomes compromised. The key word here is the word reality. The client's reality is being validated by the therapist. Then the spouse goes home, and the ability to, the word subjective reality over there, when there is a conflict between a husband and wife, it's so important for there to be a sense of subjective reality. I am I, and you are you, and we're different. And I don't really know what's going on inside of you because you're different than me. The repair of a fight, the repair of any marital conflict has to make room for subjective reality. What that means is, if my wife just did something that made me really angry, she did something, or she may have said something that I perceived as really nasty, and then she says, I didn't mean it that way. Okay, fight's over if I believe her. If I accept her subjective, because to me it really sounded like she meant it that way. Can I accept that she didn't mean it that way? When my spouse does something, my husband does something controlling, and he says, I'm sorry, it didn't come from a controlling place. I just got a little bit scared. I'm sorry. If there was a therapist, if there was an individual therapist somewhere in the background that said your husband is controlling, validated the reality, no, that was controlling. Don't tell me. It's very hard. Once a reality is validated, once reality is validated, it's very hard to experience anything else. But if that therapist would just have validated the experience, then this conversation would still be okay. A therapist only needs to validate through listening and understanding, whereas a spouse may need to validate through action. Okay? The therapist only has to say, something I touched on before, the therapist only has to say, wow, that was so hard, that must be so hard for you. Good to go. The spouse says, wow, that must be so hard for you. That could be very invalidating if I feel that you could do something about it. That's a very dangerous place for the marriage to be. If I just got validated by my therapist for this thing, and I come home and I'm not sure, and then I get an invalidating remark, I'm angry at you, I run back to my therapist. And what do we do about this? I'm just going to get to that in a minute, what we do about this. Okay, empowerment, autonomy, authenticity. I'm going to try not to get emotional for this part of the session, this part of the workshop. Because this is an area, so I won't, but this is an area that I have seen just the enormity of the pain that I've witnessed in this area alone. Just the term empowerment and how it has been used. The enormity of the pain that I've witnessed is mind-boggling. Probably the biggest impetus for me to want to do this workshop. When a therapist helps to empower a client by helping them move from a state of dependence to a state of independence, and those are the key words. The key words there are a state of dependence, I'll talk about that in a second, state of dependence and a state of independence. The result can sometimes be severe attachment injury and a sense of loneliness that is far more damaging to the client than their lack of empowerment. I had a conversation with a non-Jewish therapist in Central Jersey who works a lot with the frum community both in Muncie and Lakewood. And she made a comment, this was last year, she made a comment to me. I was working with a couple, she was working with the wife, and she said to me, this was her comment, I'm going to quote this. She said, "What's up with the therapists in your community that they're so anti-marriage?" said, what do you mean? This was her comment. I said, they take spouses and empower them out of the marriage. This is coming from a non-Jew talking about therapy in the frum community. Okay, so I said, okay, I need to do this workshop. This goes back to the statement by Sue Johnson: secure dependence and autonomy are two sides of the same coin. The more securely connected we are, the more separate and different we can be. I find it with parents and kids also. Yeah, 100%. The key words here, when a therapist helps to empower a client by helping them move from a state of dependence to a state of... So how do we empower? A client comes into my office and they feel controlled, they feel crushed, I need to empower them. I need to give them a sense of autonomy. I need to help them be authentic. The key words here are dependence and independence, right? If I'm taking them from if empowerment means I'm helping them to become dependent. They are right now dependent. He's dependent on his wife. She's dependent on her husband. There's an unhealthy dependence. And you know what? My response to an unhealthy dependence is to make them independent. I can either go from dependence to independence, or I can go from insecure dependence to secure dependence. Huge difference. I'm gonna help you stay dependent on your wife or on your husband, because that's so important. That dependence is necessary for you. You know, Bowlby's famous example of the child running away from the mother. You know, the 2-year-old running away from the mother. The 2-year-old looks back. If mommy's looking, 2-year-old keeps running. If mommy's not looking, the 2-year-old runs back. We can't self-actualize. We can't go out into the world unless we're securely attached. And Sue Johnson and others took that idea and said it's not just about a child. It's about adults, and that's what happens in a marriage. So, I go from a place of insecure dependence to secure dependence rather than going from dependence to independence. I'm going to help you stay dependent, but it's going to come from a place of security. It's going to come from a place where there's a self. It's going to come from a place where you don't need this attachment desperately, and that's why I'm so insecure. I need this attachment. No. You're secure. You want this attachment. That's the difference. There are other ways that empowerment can become disempowering. That's just important to keep in mind. So when I empower a client, if I'm going from a place of dependence to independence, what can happen is the client can learn to focus outside of themselves for the source of their emotional pain. And you know, it's if the focus, and this goes back to individual therapy, it's not like the individual therapy that you pointed out, but if the focus is, wow, your wife does that, we need to, let's see how we can move you, how we can stop your wife from doing that. Or, your stuff is based on a trigger from your wife. I'm focusing outside. I'm focusing on all the triggers. I'm focusing on all the things that are happening to me, and I need to become independent of that. It limits introspection. It limits self-awareness. It limits self-empowerment. I've seen people who have gone through this process and feel so disempowered, feel so helpless, because their whole therapy was about how bad their spouse was. And because the way they walked out of therapy this is after 2 years of therapy, they walked out with all the things that I'm doing are because my spouse does this and this and this. So there was just so much blame going on. There was so much focus on the triggers. This triggers me, that triggers me. Instead of, and the way she walked away was, I'm helpless. I'm a victim. She walked out with a sense of victimhood. It's actually the opposite of empowerment. No. No. Yeah, there are some things here that I'm bringing up. I've just witnessed it, and I just want to, it's not therapy, but the moving from dependence to independence is just so common, and I think this is not because therapists are bad people. I think a lot of it has to do with emotional immersion and their own stuff and the countertransference. Yeah. In an attempt to practice empowerment, the client may sometimes be afraid to listen to the spouse's excuses. Again, this is a line that I just put up there because I saw it several times. I'm empowered, and then it becomes very confusing. So it becomes, I'm not going to repair this. I'm not going to accept what you just said that you didn't mean that. Because if I accept that you didn't mean that, then wait a second, I'm not being independent. And I've seen people go through that confusion. It's just something to be very aware of in individual therapy while we're going through the process of helping the client. Yeah, that's. And in the third section, I'm going to go through. In the fourth section, actually, I'm going to go through. This is all the negative stuff. This is all the damage that we do. But what's the positive side of this? I'm going to go through examples of how do we do this? So this is a little bit of how we do this. Just to touch on empowerment. When we're helping a client to become more empowered, we can try to include the spouse in the dynamics of that change. This is something that's really, really important. I try to help the spouse understand the client's pain. I will bring the spouse into the room, bring the spouse into the process, help them become part of the dance. It's not about me and this client talking about another person. If this is going to be about it, and this is not couples therapy, this is individual therapy, but I am now going to help my client to say to, let's say, I'm going to help him say to his wife, instead of just completely withdrawing, and let's say when she yells at him, instead of completely withdrawing and becoming this going to his room or ignoring her or acting independently, on the one hand, or maybe instead of yelling back at her, I'm going to empower him. And that empowerment will be, maybe something like, can you look into her eyes and say, if you yell at me like that, I'm not going to be able to respond. I'm not going to be able to hear you because it's just too hurtful to me. What's that going to do to the dynamic if she doesn't know what's going on? She needs to know what's going on. I like to do it with both in the room because then it becomes a couples thing. I say, when you yell at her, she's going to respond like that now. It's a psycho-ed thing, but I'm doing it with both of them. So they're both involved in this and they're both part of the process. It's not a him and her. It's not couples therapy, but this is what I'm doing with your wife or with your husband in individual therapy. Yeah. I can send that, but I can send it for couples therapy, but that's a separate thing. As part of the individual therapy, I want the spouse to know what's happening here. Because there's a dance going on. All of a sudden, that dance is going to change. I want to help you, dance in sync. We need to bring the other spouse into that change of a dance, if possible. And by the way, in doing these steps, let me go through the steps first. First step was help the spouse understand your client's pain. I'll bring the spouse in. I'll tell them this is what, when you do that and that, your wife feels really crushed. That's why I'm going to help her respond to you like this. This is what's happening. This is what she's feeling. That's why she's responding like this. I want to help him understand that. So it's not just all of a sudden he comes on one day and his wife is standing up to him like that and he doesn't know what's going on and the dance has changed and he falls apart. No, this is what's happening. I'll do this with both of them. I'll help the spouse understand the need for change. And the focus is on workability over here. This change has to happen. Your spouse, your husband or your wife is going to have to talk to you that way. And I'm not going to get into, when I say focusing on workability, this is not couples therapy. I'm not processing dynamics. This is what needs to work in order for change to happen. It's not about right and wrong. This is what needs to work for change to happen. Help them respond to the new behavior. I'm going to. My wife gives, my wife says something to me. I yell at her, and all of a sudden she says to me, "That's very hurtful, and I'm not going to be able to respond to you if you yell at me like that." I've been married for 20 years. I never experienced this. So what do I? So what now? How does the script go further? What's my piece over here? And I'm going to help the other spouse with that. This is how maybe you can have a new conversation like this. Help them feel that they're part of the change. This is not something, I'm not sitting in this room with your husband or your wife and doing something in secret. You are part of it. This is for the benefit of both of you. Try to make it about compassion and understanding rather than confrontation. It's not like you're the bad guy and me and your husband are going to be working against you in therapy. This is about compassion and understanding and trying to make the bond a better bond. The last thing over here is, now I'm focusing on my client. When I empower a client in individual therapy, I need to help my client understand this is what your spouse is going through. And there's something here that they're going to be experiencing. They're going to be falling apart. They've never experienced this. When your husband yells at you, for 20 years you've been enabling that, and all of a sudden you're going to stop enabling that, what's that going to do to him? Does he have the tools to handle that? And can we help him deal with that? When we go through these steps, I mentioned before that when we're dealing with abuse, when there's real abuse going on in the marriage, nothing I'm talking about this morning is relevant. There's no marriage. There's other things that have to take place. But how do I know if it's really abuse? How do I know if it's not abuse? I found these steps to be a clarifier. If I can take the spouse through these steps and it works, there's not abuse going on. It's not abuse. Something could look so much like abuse. There can be such a controlling situation. You could have a situation where the husband was really controlling. He was a controlling individual. And he was crushing the wife. And the way it played out, we went through these steps, and so you mean when I do that, she feels like that? You mean when I do that without letting her know, and she really? And yet men can be that clueless. That is possible. And that it was just like an eye-opener. If you can go through these steps, you can really figure out if it is abuse or it's not abuse. Because if you can go through these steps and you get severe pushback from the other spouse, it's very possible that there's abuse going on. But you need to bring this other spouse in to be able to clarify that. Switching subjects. Therapy for trauma or other severe conditions can sometimes cause feelings of alienation and distance that the client's spouse does not understand what is happening. I had a situation recently, and I've seen this a lot, but one glaring example of this was there was a couple that came in to me. This goes back 3-4 years. They came in to me for couples work, and the couples work revolved around bedroom issues, around intimacy issues, and they came in, and after 3-4 sessions, it was really clear that there was severe trauma in her background, and I referred them out to trauma therapy. Referred her for trauma therapy. The couples therapy was really contraindicated. There was no way to work on the couples issue until she really dealt with her trauma. A year and a half later, I get a call on the phone. I didn't hear from them for a year and a half. I spoke to them 2 weeks later. They had found somebody. They didn't want the person I had. They found somebody, and a year and a half later, they called me up that they're coming in for couples therapy. The marriage was in a shambles. The husband was completely depressed. What had been taking place, he had met the wife's therapist twice in a year and a half. And nobody told him what was going on. Nobody was there walking him through the process. She worked with a great therapist, really a great therapist. She had gone through a lot of stuff from her childhood, worked it through in amazing ways. Obviously, the therapist she worked with, who I don't know, but was really, really experienced and really knew what she was doing. But nobody thought about the husband. And she was living in her own world. Talk about secure attachment. It was gone. They were living. She was going through this world of repressed memories and all kinds of EMDR and all kinds of things that were happening to her in her trauma world. And he was clueless. He had no idea what she was going through. She would be experiencing flashbacks in the middle of the night. He had no idea what was going on. He just had no idea what was happening. And after a year and a half, the marriage was in a shambles. This is a line from Sue Johnson from one of her books. She has a book on emotionally focused couples therapy for trauma survivors, which is an amazing book if anybody just wants a good book to read. If partners are not part of the problem, not part of the solution, they are almost inevitably part of the problem. We're either together on this or we're not together on this. And if we're not together on this, the partner will become part of the problem. It's not just that the trauma is the problem now. Now the trauma is the problem and the partner is the problem. Can we bring the client, even when there's trauma therapy going on, can we bring the spouse into the treatment? Hold his or her hand. Help them know what's going on. This is another quote from the same book, from Sue Johnson, but in this case she's quoting Bessel van der Kolk. Bessel van der Kolk says that it's the ability to derive comfort from another human being that ultimately determines the aftermath of trauma, not the history of the trauma itself. This is a really profound line. I heard this from Bessel van der Kolk in a lecture that he gave once. He said that at 9/11, he was called by New York City to send down a team from his Boston Trauma Center to spread out throughout the city and deal with the trauma that's going to show up in the ERs. And in the weeks after, to deal with the PTSD. And what they found was that there was very little PTSD resulting from 9/11. The trauma was beyond. There was very little PTSD. And when they studied that, they were like, what's going on? They found that there was no, even though there was so much trauma, there was no PTSD because people were together. Everybody felt like they belonged. Even the people that went through severe trauma in 9/11 were part of something. They belonged. And what came out of that was, they did a lot more studies on that. They found that what Van der Kolk says is that sometimes the most severe part of the trauma is the alienation and the isolation that the trauma victim experiences. Right? If a child is molested and right after the molestation goes home and tells the parents, and the parents give them love and go to the police, and everybody's surrounding the child and telling them it's not your fault and we love you, and that child is probably okay. There's probably no lasting trauma. There's no PTSD later on in life. So the point over here is, and the reason why Johnson brings this up in her book is, imagine then what you can do in terms of a marriage if you do bring the spouse into the trauma treatment. If the most severe part of the aftermath of a trauma is the isolation and the alienation and the sense of aloneness, then what happens if I do bring the spouse into the trauma treatment? What happens if it's not just an individual treatment, if the spouse is brought in? And the theme of this book is you can actually heal trauma in couples therapy. But not even going that far, in individual therapy, the more the individual therapist, the trauma therapist, can bring the spouse into the process, help the spouse understand what's your spouse going through, what's your husband going through, what's your wife going through. Can you understand, you know what a flashback is? Let me tell you what a flashback is, so that the next time your wife has a flashback, we can you can be there for her in a way that's very special because you understand what she's going through. Bringing the spouse into that process can be amazingly healing for the trauma. Keeping the spouse out of that process can really damage the marriage. So I'm going to go through this really quick. In long-term therapy, the client can often begin to see the world through the eyes of the therapist. This may limit the client's ability for attuned critical thinking during difficult interactions with spouse and family. In short, I'm not going to read that quote, but in short, I'm talking to my spouse and I'm thinking my therapist. And my spouse can sense that. My spouse experiences that. My judgment, I look at my therapist's judgment model, and I'm working through from that perspective. So what do we do? What do we do in terms of these problems in individual therapy? Have you spoken to your spouse about this, and can you speak to your spouse about this? I'll say that a lot. When I'm in individual therapy with a man or a woman who's telling me, sharing with me something, anything. It might be about the marriage. It might be about the mother-in-law. One of my most common remarks to somebody who's married is, can you share this with your spouse? Is this something that you can share with your wife? And I want to see that. I want to know, so am I interfering over here? Is there, and the answer might be no. But then, I might explore what's the resistance to that. Because I don't want my individual therapy to take the place of what might be happening in the marriage. So, if possible, try to help the spouse to become more attuned and more adept at validation. I mentioned this before. I'll bring the spouse in and psychoeducate about validation. Be very careful if you notice the client is relying on your judgment. Encourage and reinforce their own attempts at judgment, discernment, and decision making. This is not something that I'm not talking about a therapist who makes decisions for their clients. I'm not talking about bad therapy. I'm talking about good therapy. But our clients are watching us. They're looking at us so closely. And even when I'll try to say to us, I'll try to help the client work it through, and I'm not going to make a decision for them. They're watching us really closely and watching how we do this. And I still want to try to push it back to them as much as possible. When pointing out a client's mistakes, try to normalize these mistakes. This goes together with the one right before. Clients don't trust themselves. They come to a therapist. Therapist is wise, all-knowing, omnipotent, and the therapist knows how to do this. And then they try to do it on their own, and they make a mistake. And I might even say something sometimes to a client, I'm really good in this room. Again, upstairs in my kitchen, I would probably have made the same mistake that you made. I'll point that out. I think it's really important to normalize their mistakes so that they don't lose a sense of, the therapist just knows the answers to everything. And when I go home, I'm an idiot. So I can't even think. I'm not going to think. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk to the therapist and ask the therapist how to do this because I can't think myself. Because the last 3 times I did this, I made a mistake. So I'll tell them, the last 3 times I did it, I made a mistake also. In this room, I make much less mistakes. But that's because I'm here. Be very careful in validating reality. We talked about that. Psychoeducate about validation through words and actions. I'm not sure there's much more to do besides psychoeducation, and explore the perceived ability of the spouse to validate through actions. There's a need, I'm validating you. You're going to go home now. Your spouse can't do this. Your spouse is just going to validate through words. Maybe it's not possible to. Maybe your spouse is unable to validate with actions. You might be expecting them to be able to validate through words. When they validate, when they say to you, wow, that must be so hard for you, maybe that's all they can do. Let's explore that. Let's try to understand that so that maybe that is a validation. Maybe they really do feel bad and they feel helpless to help you instead of just being invalidating and not caring. Okay, part 3 is the potential for negative impact on couples therapy. Now we're not talking about the marriage. Now we're talking about the interface between individual therapy and couples therapy. And how do these two things play off against each other, with each other? And again, I've experienced this from both sides. I've watched myself doing things that really messed up couples therapy, and I had to call up and apologize to the couples therapist. And I had to call up individual therapists and say, this is not working. This is probably one of the most important ones, the first one. If the client's reality, I'm just going to highlight the word reality, is being or has been validated by the individual therapist, then it becomes almost impossible. And I was debating whether to leave the word almost over there, because I don't think I've ever been successful in a situation where the client, in couples therapy, as a couples therapist, if the client's reality has been validated, it becomes almost impossible for the couples therapist to be able to validate the client's experience. What I'm trying to do in couples therapy is I have 2 people here. And I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. This is what I'm experiencing. This is what I'm experiencing. The tool of the trade of therapy is validation. If I cannot validate, I cannot be a good therapist. How do you validate 2 people who have, at the same time, who have completely competing ideas of what reality is? And the answer is you validate experience. And if you can validate experience, you can validate 2 people. Can you understand how this is? I'll turn to the woman and say, that must be so hard for you. When your husband does that and you feel like that, and I'll say to the husband, could you understand how she might feel like that? I didn't say anything about the husband. I didn't say you're a controlling jerk. I just said that's what your wife is feeling. And she feels validated. And I could do that right in front of him. I can't say to the wife, wow, it must be so hard to be married to such a jerk. It won't work. Couples therapy is over. I lose the ability to be the couples therapist. So I need to validate experience. And then I could turn to the husband and say, wow, it must be so hard when your wife does that. And how you're feeling and what's going on inside of you. And she could hear that. And I could say to her, could you hear that? That back and forth experience, that back and forth validation is the bread and butter of every couples therapist. Being able to help them see each other's experience. What happens when somebody says to me, like happened in my office not long ago, somebody who had been in individual therapy for a long time and had their reality validated by an individual therapist. If the reality is validated, in other words, something as simple as, it must be so difficult to live with a very controlling husband. It must be so difficult to live with somebody who's so narcissistic. That's it. My husband is, my reality has just been validated. I am living with a man who is narcissistic and controlling, or whatever. I'm just picking on narcissistic and controlling. We could use any diagnosis you want. You could just plug in. Once the reality has been validated, it's almost impossible to validate experience. I was debating whether to leave the word almost in there because I have never been successful. Once somebody's reality has been validated by an individual therapist, I have never been successful in undoing that unless I can get the individual therapist to somehow back it out. Yeah. Another problem with validation in terms of the balance between individual therapy and couples therapy is the client may turn to the individual therapist for validation and will not need to seek validation from the couples therapist. When I'm an individual therapist and the couple, I'm doing the individual therapy side of things, and the client is seeing a couples therapist, they may come to me and say, do you know what happened at home? Or do you know what happened in couples therapy? And they're looking to validation for me for that. They're looking for me to validate their pain. This happens all the time. They're looking for me to validate the pain of what took place in the couple session. That is so dangerous. Because if I validate his pain, I've just taken away the ability of the couples therapist to be the primary validator in that room. And it's so careful. So my response to that is almost always something like, so did you discuss this with your couples therapist? I hear what happened. Wow, did you discuss this with your couples therapist? And if I have an open dialogue with the couples therapist, it might be important. I got a call from an individual therapist that I was working closely with a couple I was seeing, and she called me up and said, you're doing a horrible job validating the wife. She feels very invalidated in the room. Great. And she made me conscious of that. And it was amazing because she could so easily have become the primary validator. If I wasn't doing my job validating her, so she was running to her individual therapist to find that validation. Had the individual therapist given her that validation, I'm done. I'm history. There's nothing more that I can do there. I need to be able, just like in individual therapy, validation is so critical. In couples therapy, validation of both people is so critical for the couples therapy to work. This I've actually seen a few times come up. Client can perceive the couples therapist as someone who can validate with actions. The same thing, validation through action, validation through words. The client can perceive the couples therapist as someone who can validate with actions by shutting down the spouse's words. Did you just hear what my wife said? You're just going to let her say that? You're validating that with words? You can take an action. You can shut her down. My individual therapist can't do anything, so that the validation of words is very powerful. Again, the only thing my only answer to this is psychoeducation, and then trying to explain to them what I'm trying to do and how to get around that. Another problem with the playoff between individual therapy and couples therapy is individual therapy has a very different approach to pathology than couples therapy. If somebody comes into my office who's borderline, I might help them with DBT, I might help them with different emotional regulation skills, and I might talk to them about their problem. There's a pathology in the room. And whatever model of individual therapy you're using, there's a problem, whether you want to call it pathology, however you want to, but there's an issue. Most approaches to couples therapy tend to depathologize the relationship problems and emphasize the resources partners may have to offer each other. Use trauma as an example. These two go together. Individual therapy may see the spouse's pathology as a trigger by way of linear cause and effect, whereas marital therapy may at times simply accept it and incorporate it into therapy. A very simple example of this is, say, a woman who is suffering from PTSD from childhood sexual encounters, and from abuse, from molestation, and it's showing up as PTSD in the marriage, in the bedroom. There's a lot of intimacy issues. From a couples therapy perspective, I mean, let's say the husband, when he touches her, she falls apart, she jumps away, she screams. It's pathology, right? She has a problem. There's something wrong. She needs to go for therapy. I can look at it that way. She needs to go for therapy. And maybe she does need to go for therapy. She probably does need therapy. But in the context of the marriage, so what? I could say to the wife, how would you like your husband to touch you? What if he asks you first? Can we change something in your environment that might make it easier? What about when he touches you? I could help the husband. Could you ask your wife? Maybe you need to say something to your wife beforehand. I can create a dialogue in the marriage that can deal with this. I've just depathologized the problem. Couples therapists have been accused of, when I say couples therapists, I'm talking about myself, have been accused of, but it's out there, of not getting pathology. Like, you know, a Rav once told me, I don't think you realize how borderline she is. And I thought, no, I do realize how borderline she is. I do. I get it. I really get it. And I have to convince him that I really get it. But I'm trying to work with that in the context of, so again, if somebody is in individual therapy and the approach in individual therapy is this pathology approach, they've been in individual therapy for 3 years, there's really a psychoeducation piece that needs to happen in terms of the movement into couples therapy and what's going to happen. And it's so important. So you're saying, what does this have to do with individual therapy vis-a-vis the couples therapy? So the couples therapist will psychoeducate. No. The individual therapy has to do the individual therapist has to be the one to psychoeducate if they're still in individual therapy. I don't know if they have to, but it's so much more effective. If I'm seeing an individual and they're going for couples therapy now, I'm going to sit with them and say, you're going to go into a very different experience now. This is going to be a totally different experience. Let me share with you how this is going to look. Okay, a client that is in individual therapy may be looking for marital therapy to provide psychodynamic insight, but the marital therapy may be looking for attachment or behavioral insight. What I found is people who are in couples therapy, who are in individual therapy for years, come into marriage therapy and say, what in the world is going on over here? The reason why he did that is because of his mother. Don't you get it? It wasn't because of what I just said. It was because of his mother and his father. And I'm shifting it away from that. Yeah, you're right. It's because of it may be from the pain of his childhood, but there's something happening right here in the room right now that it caused him to react like that. Yeah, but it's because of his mother. If you go to individual therapy and deal with his childhood, he wouldn't have to. Couples therapy says, no, it's here, it's now. For somebody who has been through 5 years of individual therapy, going through their childhood, and this, by the way, you mentioned the male-female dynamic before. This is something I have seen. For some reason, men go to individual therapy a lot less than women, at least in Muncie. And when a couple comes into therapy, very often the wife has already been for 2-3 years in her own individual therapy. The husband doesn't want to hear of it. And she's gained tremendous internal insight in terms of herself, and she's hoping that when he comes into individual therapy, he'll finally gain insight into his childhood and all the things that are causing him to behave like this. And I'm not doing that. I'm helping them gain insight. I'm helping him gain insight into what's happening right now when he does this behavior, what's happening to his wife. And I'm helping the wife. And it's so unfulfilling to somebody who has been through individual therapy. It's like, you're not a therapist. That's not what therapists do. And again, there's a psychoeducation piece here that hopefully can come from the individual therapist. Couples therapy, we will often allow the couple to sit with a problem. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because it's like 20 minutes, so I'll just do the 60-second version. Couples therapy will often allow a couple to sit with a problem in order to develop a sense of we. Individual therapy can potentially interfere with this sense of we. When a couple has a problem and they come in and the wife will say, but I just can't. If he does that, I can't. And then the husband will say, but I just can't. I come home from work. I need 5 minutes. I need 5 minutes when I walk in the door. I can't just jump into the house. And the wife will say, I can't have you walk into the house and just go to a corner for 5 minutes and look at the mail. I can't. There's a problem here. I'm not the problem solver. And I'm going to let them sit with that problem. We're just sitting with it. And what I found is that, in general, people, it's the first time they're like, what are you doing? But again, people who have gone through individual therapy, I just find that they find this much more difficult, especially if they're in individual therapy right now. If they're in a solution-focused individual therapy, for sure, this is just not going to work. And again, it's psychoeducation on the part of the individual therapist, not on the part of the couples therapist. Because the couples therapist very often is the new kid on the block. If the individual therapist can do that psychoeducation, it's amazing. I started, when I was working on this workshop, I started to put together a protocol for, okay, so what do we do? How does, and in my research, I found that William Doherty already did a presentation. It was out there. I found it online. I found it on the University of Minnesota website. I found his slides, and I sent him an email. I said, I'm doing this presentation. Can I use your slides? And he sent me back and said, sure, go ahead. So these are his slides. So that's just there. He developed this protocol called CSI, Couple-Sensitive Individual Therapy. And it's really just everything we've been talking about. How do I practice individual therapy with a sensitivity to the couple? So just the definition of CSI is individual psychotherapy that is mindful of the potential impact of therapeutic conversations and interventions on the client's intimate partner and the couple relationship. This does not refer to couples therapy with an individual, although many of the principles and strategies apply. There is such a thing out there as couples therapy with individuals, which we're not going to talk about now, but that's not what we're talking about. Here are the challenges, and some of this might be a little bit of a review, so I'm going to go through it quickly. How to create a therapeutic alliance without being drawn into the client's inevitably one-sided reality about the relationship. And we've talked about that. We're trying to create a therapeutic alliance, and the answer to this is validation of experience. If I can validate the experience, I create a therapeutic alliance. If I validate reality, I get drawn into the one-sided reality about the relationship. How do I avoid becoming an emotional lawyer whose job is to advocate for one side in a relationship conflict? I know I've been guilty of this. I think most therapists it's so easily fall into this trap. I'm sitting there, I'm in this emotional immersion, I'm the caregiver, I'm hearing all this pain. It's so hard. It's so hard not to take sides. It's so hard not to become an emotional lawyer. How to avoid turning the spouse partner into a cardboard character because we don't know them. And we're constructing the spouse in the room. Spouse is not there. We're constructing them with confirmation bias and all those other things. What do we do with the negative feelings that we experience when the clients describe negative things their spouse has said or done? And I did not go too much. I was thinking, should I go into the countertransference? But there's so much stuff written about the countertransference that goes on over here. Because I work with Gottman and Sue Johnson a lot, I don't spend too much time reading psychoanalytic journals. That's not where I hang out. But I found, again, in doing the research, I found some really fascinating stuff on the countertransference in individual therapy vis-a-vis the marriage. And I just realized that if you want to know anything about countertransference, you've got to go to the psychoanalytic journals. I mean, these guys have it down pat. Behavioral journals and CPT journals are just like scraping the surface. There's so much to be said about the countertransference in the room. I'm not going to say it because it's a whole other workshop. It's a whole other thing, but it's there. How can I, if I'm watching myself, how do I see that, or I'm watching another therapist, how do I see that the therapy is not couple sensitive? Letting the client engage in psychological assessment of their partner. I'm going to change this line a drop. I just used Doherty's slides as is. I wanted to change that word, letting the client. I didn't like that, but I'm just going to leave it and tell you how I do let the client engage in psychological assessment of their partner. I don't tell them what to do. I just don't buy into it. That's the difference. I slowly and gently, yes. But, yeah, but if in the first session they come to me with a book, which has happened, client walks in with a book, this is my wife. And with tabs in the pages and highlighted. Yes, yeah, it was highlighted. So I allow that. I didn't say, how do you know? I'll let that happen. Slowly, I'm going to gently try to challenge that. Regularly commenting on the spouse's personality limitations. Your husband does not seem to be an emotionally available person. It seems like such a benign remark. Like, what's the big deal? This woman is sitting there telling me how I cried to him and he just sits there staring off into space. It's so easy for me to say, oh, your husband doesn't seem to be an emotionally available person. Boom. I just validated her reality, and I really don't know what's going on with the husband. I have no idea what's happening with the husband. Offering a diagnosis for the spouse without having done an assessment. I am guilty of that. I will admit. I have done that. And it's just so hard not to. When you're sitting there and listening to, this is borderline. Wow, he's married to a borderline. For sure, borderline. Consistently attributing negative motives to the spouse. Why do you think she wants to control you? Again, it's such a benign remark, but it's a validation of reality. It's a depends question. I may want to help. I may want to help the spouse. I may want to validate his reality in certain ways. Like sometimes when somebody's living with a borderline spouse, they are very confused. Like I don't know what's going on, and maybe in that sense I want to validate the reality. But yeah. The point I'm making here, I think more than anything else, there are individual cases where there has to be an exception. The point I'm making is that we really need to be really careful. I think that's the best way to say it. We really need to be really careful. Before I slap a borderline diagnosis on a spouse, am I 100% sure? Do I know that that's what's going on? And being so sure it's tough. I'm a big advocate for bringing the spouses into the room, even in individual therapy, and sometimes that can clarify. If I've sat with the spouse for 2-3 sessions, or I've watched the two of them interact together, I might feel more comfortable saying what you just said. But without ever meeting the spouse, I wouldn't do that.
At least as long as you don't know that.
Yeah. Okay. Expressing pessimism that the spouse can change without knowing that person. People don't change their way of relating at this age. These are such small, benign remarks that sometimes seem so harmless, and they cause so much damage. Continuation of that, these are the things we should not do. Really challenging the client's perspective about his or her contributions to the relationship problems. We're focusing these challenges mainly on why the client has put up with such a difficult spouse. Slowly but surely, I need to bring challenges into the room. Really expressing empathy for what the spouse might be experiencing. And it's the same thing that we're talking about the whole time. So here's the other side of that. Well, not yet. The consequences of couples intensive therapy. There are three very distinct consequences. The first one is undermining potentially viable marriages and committed relationships, which is what we're talking about the whole time. This just undermines marriages. But it does more than that. It fails to help the client learn and develop through relationship difficulties. I'm not helping the client see there's a relationship difficulty here. What's your part in this? There's such a tremendous learning opportunity. And I would go so far as to say I might get some pushback on this, but even when there's clear abuse going on, I'm not talking about physical abuse, but when there's verbal and emotional abuse, there's an opportunity here to help the client. To help the client come to a place of, looking the spouse in the face and saying, no, I'm not going to stand here and take that. You're being very hurtful now, and I'm not going to respond, or I'm not going to go into a dialogue with you. Or helping the client look inside themselves. What just happened to you when your wife did that to you? What just happened inside of you? What did that do? If all I'm talking about is the reaction and what the wife did, I'm not helping him see what happened inside of him. What are his attachment wounds? Yeah.
Is in mind and vice versa.
Right. There is another person in the room. There is another person here who is just as human as you. So I failed to help the client learn and develop through the relationship difficulties. I distort the clinical relationship. The clinical relationship, I become the emotional lawyer. Our whole alliance is distorted. It's not about, I'm going to help you become the best person you can be. So the two goals are, one, in the two master strategies in CSI therapy. Here's what we're trying to do. We want to align with the client's therapeutic goals, not with the person against someone. Again, I would say this even with abuse. It's not about you against him or you against her. It's what are your therapeutic goals? How can I help you? Now, helping you might be helping you get out of the marriage. Helping you might, but how can I help you. That's what this is about. How can I help you be a better person? And how to help the client manage self during relationship difficulties. Okay, so again, I keep on stressing this, even in abuse situations. It's how can I help you learn to manage yourself? What just happened to you? Your wife just looked at you. Your husband just looked at you that way. Your husband just made a remark in front of his whole family. What happened to you, and how could you manage yourself in that situation so that you can respond in a way that's empowered? Okay, so these are the skills. This is how, again, this is Doherty slides. This is how he lines up the skills. I'm just going to go through them actually quite quickly. But I think most of them will be very obvious after the discussion we've just had. Empathize with the client's pain, not necessarily with their perspective. Again, this goes back to validating experience, but not necessarily validating reality. So, for example, what an awfully painful moment for you, as opposed to I can see how hurt you were when your husband put you down in front of his family like that. That second line is a validation of reality. It puts the focus on the husband. It almost removes the necessity for introspection and self-growth. Not my fault, it's my husband's fault. Yeah. Paraphrase the client's perspective neutrally. So I think she doesn't trust you. You think she doesn't trust you and wants to control you. Putting those words, I think, you think, you feel, kind of makes the rest of the sentence safe. When you're confident, this is really important, and it needs to be done in a gentle way. When you're confident the client feels you're connecting with their feelings, you've developed a rapport, then and only then explore the client's own part in the relationship dance. You want to do this not in the first session. You want to do this when you've really developed a rapport, and then you might start saying, what do you think your wife may have felt when you did that? I mean, when you said this and this and this, let's try to understand what was going on inside of her. If the client draws a blank in that conversation, like, I don't know, what do you think was going on inside of her? I might try to offer some ideas. Maybe it could be this, maybe it could be that. Do you think it might have been embarrassing for her? And these last two, very carefully, very gently, because you still want to you don't want to lose the unconditional positive regard. You don't want the client to feel judged. You really have to have that rapport before you start in this phase. Work with whatever the client initially accepts as his or her part and expand on it over time. This is an exploration process. If the client says, yeah, I got really angry, I couldn't hold myself back from yelling. Okay, so what made you angry? What was going on over there? Where was the pain behind that anger? There's something here to explore. Where else does that pain show up? Speculate about the spouse's part of the dance, but not on his or her personality. It's so important to focus on the behavior of the spouse. They behave this way, but let's not talk about what's going on in the spouse's mind because we don't know. It's not there. Yeah, your husband said something to you in front of your family that embarrassed you. That was the action. That was an action that took place. But why he did that, what aspects of his personality made him do that, that's just something we're constructing. That's all speculation. So important. Speculate about the soft feelings under the spouse's hard feelings. So something like, I wonder if your wife's anger that feels so controlling is coming partly from her feeling disconnected from you. Just in that sense, we could explore the spouse's feeling. I said don't explore what's going on in the spouse's mind, but maybe there's some attachment wounds over here that we could explore. Keyword is I wonder, yeah. Very, very important. Very, very important. Don't justify the spouse's unacceptable behavior. Again, what your husband did, what your wife did was wrong. We're not just by saying that maybe there was an attachment injury that caused your spouse to behave this way doesn't justify the behavior. I'm not justifying the behavior. But what I'm focusing on is, so what's your response to it? The therapeutic alliance. It's not right that he curses you. And even like this, even when there's something clearly abusive going on, it's not right that he curses you. But let's talk about how you can respond next time. It's about you. It's about empowering you. Ask the client to bring the spouse in for a session. I think this is probably the most important slide here. To do individual therapy from when there's marital issues involved and never having seen the spouse, you're working in the dark. But what does it look like when you bring the spouse in? You're not doing couples therapy. Stay away from that. what does it do? It gives you a perspective on your client. I find this happen. I'm working with a client 4 or 5 sessions, and then the spouse comes in, and it's such an aha moment. Like, oh, okay, I got it.
You
Was
said
it?
you can't visiting day when parents come, you see who the parents and kids are.
Yeah, same idea. It allows the spouse to see who you are, which I think is so important. It's not a black box. It's not this black box. My husband, my wife goes off to therapy. I don't know what's going on over here. Oh, okay. So he's a nice guy. You know, that's he's not out to get me. It affirms the spouse for willingness to come in. You're bringing the spouse into the process. You are important over here. Treat the spouse as a help for your client's therapy, not like a client. Okay? He or she is not your client. Very, very important. And you're not going to try to figure out anything here therapeutically. Don't try not to go. This can be very hard, but try not to go there. Because you only have this one session, and you're probably going to open up something that's not going to be helpful. Don't turn the session into a problem-solving couples therapy. Again, really hard. This is really hard, but you need to try not to go there. Something therapeutic might occur, but stay away from couples therapy. 2 useful questions. I like these 2 questions. What do I need to know about you to be more effective with you, with your spouse? Tell me about yourself so that I can help your partner. It's such an important question, and I found it just opens people up. It opens them up, they share, and now they feel like they're part of it. And how do the issues your spouse and I are working on here affect you and your relationship? The other way. I want to show interest. I want them to know that I care about the relationship. I care about the marriage. The marriage is really important to me. Maybe the only thing I'm going to say here of importance is the why are you staying versus what's keeping you here. I will never ask a spouse, why are you staying in a marriage? I don't care how bad the marriage is. I don't care how much abuse. I once had a supervisor that said, never use the word why. I don't know if I go that far, but in this case, why are you staying makes the spouse feel, oh, so I shouldn't be. It's almost like you're saying, when I say to a spouse, why, so why are you staying in this marriage? Somebody is there with a horrible, abusive, controlling marriage. Why are you staying in this marriage? Really what I said to the spouse was, you should leave. And there's something wrong with you if you don't. There's a judgment in that. The why has a judgment in it. And then the exploration is gone. I've eliminated the possibility. When you're working in a situation where you trying to help somebody figure out an individual therapy. This is an individual therapy that's trying to decide to stay in a marriage or not. It's important to what's keeping you here is a valid question. That I've asked clients. So what's keeping you here? That's an exploration because you know what? There always is something. And that needs to be explored. The space between is a term. It's attributed to Martin Buber. I was Googled it, and where's the source from it? Is attributed to Martin Buber. So what? But I think that it goes much further back. It's not just the space between precedes Martin Buber. The first time that I know of that the space between occurs is by the Kruvim. The space between the Kruvim. What were the Kruvim? The Kruvim sat on the Arda Kodesh, the holiest place in the universe. It was a male and a female. And they were facing each other. And Chazal tell us that space between, I don't remember the exact Lashon and Lashon Kodesh, but the space between the faces of the Kruvim is where Nevuah, when Moshe Rabbeinu got his Nevuah, it came from that space between the Kruvim. That's the place where the universe touches God, so to speak. That space between the male and female is the holiest place in the universe. It's just something when we're sitting with an individual or a couple, especially when we're sitting in an individual and we don't see the couple, just to be able to be aware of that. There's something going on here that's Kedusha. It's now, the question that you can ask on that is, the Kruvim were children. You know about the Kruvim, male and female, they're facing each other, the space between. What's that all about? Why children? We spent the last 3 hours talking about 2 adults facing each other in the space between 2 adults. Why is the holiest place in the universe the space between 2 children? So I don't know if any of you have done an EFT externship, have seen this picture. Sue Johnson loves showing this picture, but here's the picture. The space between two children is the holiest place in the universe. The picture speaks for itself, so. And that's it.